Before we start, a content warning. This episode will involve discussions about drugs. For the most part, we will focus on alcohol, because alcoholism is the most widespread substance abuse disorder in the world, excluding middle-aged woman on Facebook needs coffee-itis, and she's not ignoring me because I said I think Andrew Tate has some good ideas, she's probably just busy, apathy. However, we will allude to more hardcore substances as well, especially heroin. If that makes you uncomfortable, then I would suggest you listen to this episode on silent, so that I can still get the streams, but you don't have to subject yourself to something you don't want to be subjected to. Also, keep in mind that this episode is not professional advice for how to quit an addiction. We will look at the science involved in these processes, but if you are genuinely struggling with substance abuse, then please seek professional assistance. I am just a guy with a microphone. Thank you, and I hope the rest of you enjoy the episode. Alcohol is weird. Really weird. Now, to be fair, most things are weird when you think about them hard enough. Like, have you ever thought about music? That's just sounds in a pattern. Why do we listen to that? Or why do we drink cow's milk? Isn't that odd? Humans can literally make milk already, but instead of drinking that, we steal the milk from adult cows, which is designed for baby cows, mind you, and we, adult humans, drink it as if that's the totally normal thing to do? What? But alcohol is especially odd. Like, can you even imagine trying to explain human drinking culture to an alien? Well, you see, there's this substance we've learned to make by leaving fruits and grains to break down over time that results in a poisonous liquid with psychoactive properties that slows down our neurobiological functioning, leaving us weak and vulnerable in the case of emergencies, reduces our social inhibition so we can relive the experience of being an impulsive child who frequently does things they'll regret, and, in large enough doses, kills us. Even when it doesn't kill us, ingesting this substance leads to sickness, nausea, and vomiting as our bodies attempt to purge themselves of its corruption, and regular usage leads to disease, cancer, and brain cell death. In spite of this poison plays an integral role in many human societies, forming the basis of entertainment, socialization, diet, romance, recreation, religion, and more, with around 3/4 of adult humans partaking in this substance voluntarily, of their own accord, for some reason. Like, what? That's absurd. It sounds ridiculous. And yet, drinking alcohol is seen as completely normal, perhaps more so than any other drug, bar caffeine. Hell, statistically, chances are pretty good that you, person listening to this podcast, drink alcohol too. And I'm not here to shame you for that. It's your life, so as long as you're a legal adult, do what you want with it. It would be a pretty short episode, not to mention boring, if all I did was try convincing you not to drink. Chances are you already know what's wrong with alcohol. That's nothing new. And besides, it might be in real life, but me sitting here body-shaming your liver for 45 minutes certainly isn't psychology, so I'd hardly be living up to this show's name. What I want to do instead then is talk about the psychology of how people learn to drink alcohol, both in harmless and problematic contexts. After all, drinking is a learned behaviour. We're not born with an innate desire to seek alcohol the way we're born to seek sugar, for instance. Most children love the taste of chocolate. Not many appreciate vodka. When people talk about wine or spirits being an acquired taste, what that really means is that it is a learned behaviour. And if something has been learned, then that puts it squarely in the territory of psychology. So today is going to be a finale of sorts for our explorations into learning psychology. We're going to take a look at the last type of learning, simple learning, then we'll revisit operant conditioning, classical conditioning, and social learning theory one last time, and see what they can tell us about why we humans are so eager to drink poison with our buddies. So, without further ado, welcome to Psychology I.R.L, the show where I assert my nerddom by demonstrating my inscrutable ability to kill the buzz. Today's episode, putting it all together and why we drink poison. Today's episode is going to be a little different from normal. Instead of the typical two-part structure in which we begin by looking at the theory, then moving on to an applied example, we're going to integrate the two halves. This is for the simple reason that most of the theories we're going to use today I've already discussed at length in the past. I will, of course, summarize them here, but if you haven't listened to any of the last 3 episodes, I would recommend listening to them first. I also want to flag here that whilst most of the analysis today will be framed around alcohol specifically, a lot of the same principles apply to other substances, ranging from caffeine and marijuana to opioids and amphetamines. I've chosen alcohol because I think it's the easiest example for most people to wrap their heads around. But if replacing the word alcohol with strawberry vape makes things easier for you, then you have my permission to do that. So let's cap our discussion of the psychology of learning off by looking at the final type of learning you are likely to encounter in a psychology course: simple learning. Simple learning is a category of learning that is not complicated. To be specific, when I talk about simple learning, what I'm really referring to is non-associative learning. Associative learning is the type of learning we've looked at so far, in which multiple concepts, behaviours, or stimuli come to be associated with one another. In operant conditioning, a behaviour becomes associated with an outcome, whilst in classical conditioning, two or more stimuli become associated with each other. Simple, non-associative learning occurs when there's only one stimulus at play. There are no reinforcers or punishers, no conditional and unconditioned responses, no social models or cognitions. Simple learning is the type of learning that occurs when an organism is repeatedly exposed to the same stimulus, leading to a change in how that organism responds to that stimulus. Simple learning can take two forms: habituation and sensitization. Habituation occurs when you are repeatedly exposed to the same stimulus, leading to a decrease in your responding to that stimulus. For instance, think about a time when you've been studying or reading in a public place, like a park or cafe. Have you ever thought about how incredible it is that your brain is able to zone out all that noise around you? I mean, there are so many sounds going on all around you at any given time. People talking, birds chirping, cars rumbling, dogs barking, customers complaining, bosses shouting, supervillains monologuing, superheroes car throwing, love interest self-sacrificing, protagonist love declaring, plot armor resurrecting, happy ending ever aftering, and so on. And yet for the most part, we're able to zone these things out. This is due to habituation. Over time and through repeated exposure, you respond less to the stimuli around you as you learn that they're relatively unimportant. As another example, think about your clothes. In the least creepy way I can say this, how do they feel against your skin? What's the texture like? Can you feel the fabric that they're made out of? Well, probably, but that's because I pointed it out to you. Chances are that up until about 3 seconds ago, you'd completely stopped responding to the feeling of your clothes against your skin. Which makes sense. It would be a waste of time and effort to be constantly stressing about the feeling of your jeans. So we become habituated to the sensation unless it's especially egregious. The opposite of habituation is sensitization, which occurs when repeated exposure to a stimulus actually increases our responding to it. An example of this is something dangerous, like a fire alarm or a gunshot. If you suddenly hear a gunshot, you'll pay attention to it, sure, but you'll pay even more attention to the second, and even more to the third, because now you're scared and on high alert. In this case, you've learned that this particular stimulus is of importance, so you pay more attention to it. These concepts might seem fairly basic, but they're super useful when it comes to explaining the world around us, including drinking behaviour. Habituation, for instance, serves as the answer to our first question, which is, how do humans learn to tolerate the taste of alcohol in the first place? Well, repeated exposure to a stimulus decreases our responding to it. Acquired tastes, like wines and spirits, are a form of habituation. Most of us find them somewhat unpleasant at first, but learn to tolerate them through repeated exposure as our responding to them decreases. And for all the macho men out there who insist that they actually do like the taste of spirits and they always have, sure, but habituation explains all sorts of other acquired tastes too. Not to mention that it provides an explanation for the rest of us who do have functioning taste buds. And as a bit of a side note here, sensitization can play a role in alcoholism too, through a process called reverse tolerance, in which we become increasingly sensitive to the psychological effects of a drug with each use. This isn't always particularly noticeable in the average 21-year-old in the club, but it is relevant to more severe forms of alcoholism, as the liver damage alcohol causes ironically makes some heavy drinkers more susceptible to the effects of alcohol. That's less psychology and more liverology, but it's still worth mentioning. So, habituation helps explain how we learn to stomach the taste of alcohol in the first place. But who cares about the taste of alcohol? That's not why we're talking about it. Over time and through exposure, you could become habituated to the taste of cyanide or dishwasher liquid. That doesn't necessarily mean you'll start doing shots of them with your buddies after work. Something being less unpleasant isn't the same as it being pleasant. So forget tolerating it. How do we learn to enjoy drinking? Well, perhaps it's time to reintroduce the concept that we started this show with: operant conditioning. Operant conditioning, for those of you who don't know or don't remember, is learning through consequences. When the consequence of a behaviour increases the strength of that behaviour, like getting paid making you more likely to go to work, or winning on slot machines one time making you more likely to waste your unemployment benefits gambling, it's called reinforcement. When the consequence weakens the behaviour, like getting humiliated each time you talk to an individual of your desired gender at the club, it's called punishment. In the case of alcohol, those of us who drink probably do so because we find it enjoyable. In other words, the addition of a pleasant outcome, the buzz of getting drunk, strengthens the behaviour of drinking. It is positive reinforcement. You could also make the case that people drink alcohol for negative reinforcement too. After all, alcohol can take certain feelings away as well. This can range from a 20-something introvert in the club doing a few shots before asking someone out to reduce their social inhibition, to an alcoholic sitting alone at home drinking their sorrows away. In both instances, an unpleasant feeling is being removed, be that nervousness or despair, strengthening the behaviour of drinking in the process. This helps explain why people with depressive disorders are more likely to fall into substance abuse than people who are psychologically healthy. Drinking alcohol to forget about your troubles provides a more substantial reward to someone in the depths of despair than it does to someone who's perfectly happy being sober. But operant conditioning can explain alcohol dependence even further than that. In our episode on the topic, we spoke about the different schedules of reinforcement through which a reinforcer can be delivered. These can be fixed or variable, depending on whether they're predictable or not, and ratio or interval, depending on whether they're based on the number of times a behaviour is repeated or the amount of time that has passed. Drinking is, arguably, a variable ratio schedule. It doesn't matter how long you wait, you'll only get drunk if you, drink. But the amount you have to drink varies. Not massively so, which is why this is only arguably a variable ratio, but it's not going to be the same each night. The amount you have to drink varies depending on a whole host of factors, which means that, although you can kind of guess how much you might need to drink to get drunk, it's hard to get it down to a science. In other words, getting drunk is dependent on a variable ratio schedule. Yep, you heard it here first. Drinking beer is, in fact, gambling. Which will go some way towards explaining why people tend to drink more than is ideal when they go out to party. As I've mentioned, variable ratio schedules are the same schedules used by gambling, and, as we saw in the first episode, social media algorithms, which makes them highly addictive and hard to stop, even when you know you probably should. Which makes a certain degree of sense in this context. If you're trying to drink your nerves away, it's easier to just keep drinking and pay the consequences later than it is to stop prematurely, even if it's probably for the best. Now, if you're a nerd, you might be thinking, but wait, aren't there unpleasant consequences associated with drinking alcohol too? Like vomiting and hangovers. Aren't these positive punishments, which decrease the strength of a behaviour? If so, why do so many people vomit their guts up one night, then get right back to drinking the next? And although it's true that a particularly traumatic experience with alcohol may serve as a punisher that leads to someone going sober, it generally has to be especially unpleasant for this to occur. There are a number of reasons why this is the case, but if I can offer a personal theory, it might have something to do with the fact that the buzz of drinking typically comes before the fall. In the episode on operant conditioning, we spoke about the Ainsley-Racklin rule, which states that the choice between two rewards is determined by the value of those rewards at that point in time, with rewards in the future being valued less than immediate rewards. In the case of alcohol, the buzz people often experience is an immediate short-term reward, whereas the vomiting and nausea and self-hate kicks in a bit later, meaning that at the point in time at which someone is faced with the choice to drink or remain sober, the reward of getting drunk is worth comparatively more than the punishment of a hangover. As with most situations, short-term gratification usually wins out. So that's one perspective we can take when trying to explain why people drink. drinking can increase positive feelings and remove negative feelings, which acts as positive and negative reinforcement respectively, strengthening the behaviour. In particular, because the benefits of alcohol are more immediate than its consequences, the association between drinking and feeling good is more easily conditioned than the association between drinking and throwing up. Although, if one does have an especially bad experience with alcohol, it could act as positive punishment, making them less likely to drink in the future. And, to be fair, the same could happen with negative punishment, if someone lost a job or a partner because of their drinking. So that's a useful lens through which to view alcoholism, but it's certainly not the only one. What other perspectives could we take? Well, for another idea, we could look at alcohol through the lens of social learning theory, which we looked at in the third episode. Social learning theory argues that learning is not just a clinical process of reinforcement and punishment, although that certainly plays a role. Instead, learning involves cognitive and social factors, because, social learning theory. First, we can learn behaviours surrounding alcohol through vicarious reinforcement. Alcohol is, often, consumed in very social contexts, so it's entirely possible that people start drinking because they see other people getting drunk and enjoying the experience. I mean, that being said, if anyone's ever been sober around drunk people before, I'm not entirely sure how any part of that experience would sell you on drinking. But, it could happen. Or perhaps drinking behaviours are learned through observational learning, in which we observe the behaviours of the people around us, called models, and choose to copy them. In this case, if someone is surrounded by people who drink, then it's entirely possible they will start to do so themselves through nothing more than the powers of observation. And sure enough, if someone's parents drink alcohol, they're more likely to drink alcohol themselves. Though, to be fair, this isn't necessarily due to observational learning. It could simply be that if your parents drink, then they're probably going to be more open and accepting to the concept of you drinking. Alternatively, another factor, like poverty or religiosity, could explain the relationship, as children born to low-income families or less religious families are more likely to drink due to their social situation rather than due to observational learning. Still, it's possible. All sorts of behaviours can be learned by observing the people around us, so there's no real reason why drinking, and especially problematic drinking, should be an exception. If a child has grown up watching their parents drink their problems away, then it would hardly be a surprise if that's how they choose to face their own. That's all they know. Reciprocal determinism, another aspect of social learning theory we discussed, has a place in this discussion too. Reciprocal determinism refers to the ways in which an individual's behaviours, cognitions, and environment can mutually influence each other. In the case of problematic drinking, for instance, someone who thinks that they're worthless and will never achieve anything in their life, a cognition, might be more likely to start problem drinking, a behaviour, which leads to them not showing up to work, so they lose their job, a change in the environment, which makes them feel even more worthless, a cognition, and so on. Even in more benign instances of drinking, reciprocal determinism can mean we get stuck in endless repeating cycles of thoughts, behaviours, and environments. Take someone who thinks they're unattractive, say because they run an educational podcast in their spare time, which is a cognition, so they drink whenever they're in social situations, a behaviour, which leads to whoever they're hitting on being immensely put off by their drunken ramblings about Edward B. Twitmeyer, a change in the environment, which reinforces that individual's belief that they are unattractive, leading to more drinking and more put-off women, and so on and so on. Hypothetically. Other social factors play a role in drinking behaviour too. Perhaps the most important here is the concept of conformity. In psychology, conformity refers to when we change our behaviour in response to group pressure, like how a clique of teenagers might dress the same and listen to the same music, or how your father's buddies from the pub all have the exact same, equally incorrect political opinions. I have an entire episode planned to discuss the concept of conformity, so I won't speak about it too much here, but it's worth mentioning that conformity plays a massive role in drinking behaviour. After all, that's what peer pressure is, the idea that you'll change your behaviour to fit into the group. So if somebody's friends drink, whether that's shots at the bar or a glass of wine with dinner, then it's understandable that they might start drinking too. So we've got two potential explanations for why people drink. A behaviourist account that describes drinking in terms of reinforcement and punishment, and a social constructivist account that describes it in terms of observational learning and reciprocal determinism. Whilst the exact terminology here might seem obnoxious, chances are the actual concepts are fairly straightforward so far, and are mostly just a way to label common sense ideas. What I'd like to focus on now then is something you may be less familiar with: the role classical conditioning plays in drinking. Classical conditioning, to recap, is learning by associating different stimuli so that the natural response to one stimulus occurs in response to the other. An example we looked at in the classical conditioning episode was someone who had a bad experience drinking and now feels sick whenever they taste alcohol, even if the actual substance is non-alcoholic or in a low enough dose that it doesn't affect them. They've learned to associate the taste of alcohol with sickness, meaning their body will kick in and steer them away from anything that tastes like alcohol in the future, even if it wasn't technically the taste that poisoned them. And whilst that's certainly true, classical conditioning plays a much larger role in drinking than just that. For instance, classical conditioning can occur the other way around, so that people come to have positive responses to alcohol. After all, in the same way that the taste of alcohol can be paired with unpleasant experiences, like vomiting in a stranger's toilet, it can also be paired with stimuli that elicit positive responses, like your friends, or loud, obnoxious music, or epilepsy-inducing lights, or whatever else it is that draws you to environments in which alcohol takes a prominent role. Can you tell I don't go to the club very often? Through classical conditioning, you learn to associate alcohol with positive experiences, so that alcohol itself comes to elicit a positive response. That's another possible angle we could take when explaining why people drink alcohol, but classical conditioning goes even further in this discussion than that. For instance, have you ever thought about how weird it is that we develop tolerances to drugs? Someone who has never touched alcohol in their life will get drunk much quicker than someone who has been drinking regularly for years, all else being equal. And for the most part, we take that as a given. But why is that the case? It's not like your liver gets bigger. I mean, it might. I'm not a doctor, but I don't think it does. How then do we learn to tolerate substances? Well, no doubt, there is a biological explanation for how these things work, and I'm sure someone who knows more than me could explain it. But believe it or not, classical conditioning is at least partially responsible for how we develop drug tolerances. This occurs through what are called conditioned compensatory responses. The way this works is that each time we use a psychoactive substance, be that alcohol, weed, heroin, or TikTok, our brains create all sorts of associations between that drug and the environment around us through classical conditioning. It then uses this information to prepare our bodies to respond to the drug the next time we take it. The guiding principle beneath this process is the concept of homeostasis, or the idea that our bodies try to maintain balance at all times. When we use drugs, they result in changes within our bodies that disrupt this equilibrium. Cocaine increases blood pressure, marijuana increases heart rate, alcohol increases actual real-world desirability, trust me on that one, and so on. Your body then tries to maintain homeostasis by counteracting these effects. Conditioned compensatory responses are classically conditioned responses that occur when you identify stimuli in the environment that you have learned to associate with a particular substance. These stimuli can range from the taste of alcohol, to the aroma of your smoker buddies, to the sight of your favorite bartender's mustache. Through classical conditioning, your brain has learned to associate these stimuli with using the drug, so it triggers a conditional response. However, instead of a conditional response that corresponds to the unconditioned stimulus, as is usually the case, this response is the inverse of the drug's effects. So for instance, although people often report feeling warm and flustered while drinking, alcohol actually decreases your body's temperature. However, when your brain identifies stimuli in the environment that it associates with alcohol, it actually increases your body's temperature. This is done to ensure your body remains at a point of equilibrium. Your brain has learned that the sight, sound, sense, and sins of the club predict the effects of alcohol, which includes a decrease in temperature, so it increases your body temperature in preparation. This is how drug tolerances work. Your body learns, through classical conditioning, to predict the effects of the drug, and it counteracts them to ensure your body keeps its balance. That's why you have to drink more to get drunk or smoke more to get high once you've been doing it for a while. Your brain has learned the correct associations and is doing everything in its power to mitigate the effects of the drug, much to your dismay. And there's a decent amount of research out there to support this approach to understanding drug tolerance. For instance, a study by Shapiro and Nathan in 1986 involved administering alcohol to participants in one environment and a non-alcoholic drink to them in another, then giving both participants alcohol in one of the two environments and asking them to complete a test of cognition. As it turns out, those who had previously drunk in the test environment performed significantly better than those who had not. Why? Well, because that group had learned, through classical conditioning, to offset the effects of alcohol, whilst the other group was not expecting alcohol and so was affected more deeply by it. At the same time, when both groups were given a non-alcoholic drink in one of the two environments, the group that had been expecting alcohol exhibited improved cognition. Why? Well, because their bodies had assumed they were going to be given alcohol, which would inhibit their cognition, so they were working hard to counteract its effects and maintain equilibrium. When the effects of alcohol didn't kick in, however, they were left more aware than they would have been otherwise. So that's your daily study advice. Next time you have an exam or assessment of some sort to complete, make sure you get hammered in the exam hall first, so that by the time you actually have to sit the exam, your brain kicks in and starts boosting your cognition in preparation for shots that won't come, leaving you smarter than you would have been otherwise. Allegedly. Now, to be fair, this is a nearly 40-year-old study conducted on a grand total of 16 people, so the results should be taken with a healthy dose of skepticism. But compensatory condition responses pop up elsewhere in the literature too. In a classic study by Siegel and colleagues from 1982, two groups of rats were each given 15 doses of heroin, because they had to do something with all the drugs the Reagan administration had confiscated, whilst a third group served as a control condition. Then, all the rats were given a very large dosage of heroin. 96% of the rats in the control condition died, because that's what happens when you give a rat a lethal dose of heroin. The groups that had previously been exposed to heroin died at lower rates. Which makes sense. We'd assume that, having previously received 15 doses of heroin, these rats would have built up a degree of tolerance to the drug. But things differed between the groups depending on whether the rats were given the final dosage in the same room they were given the other 15. 32% of the rats who received the final dose in the same room as all the others died, compared to 64% for those who received the final dose in a different room. What the study demonstrates then is the life-saving advantage that conditioned compensatory responses provide. The rats who received all the doses in the same room had, through classical conditioning, learned to prepare for the heroin, which meant they survived at twice the rate the rats who were moved around did. Those rats, although they had also developed a tolerance to heroin, were used to receiving it in a different room, meaning their compensatory responses didn't kick in the new room. This is a massive finding with important real-world ramifications. Not to belittle rat lives, of course, and imply that they aren't part of the real world, but the point is that this serves as the theoretical basis for injecting rooms, which are dedicated medical facilities in which drug addicts can use particular substances under the supervision of trained staff. The argument is, in essence, that drug addicts will continue to use the drug, whether it's illegal or not. So rather than trying to ban these substances or punish addicts, we should instead find ways to minimize the harms associated with drug use. Injecting rooms do this by allowing the patient to use whatever substance they're addicted to in a safe, controlled environment. This minimizes the risk of overdose, both because healthcare staff are on hand to monitor the dosage, and because it provides a familiar environment for injection to take place in. See, the term overdose is itself somewhat misleading, because whilst it's entirely possible to die due to taking too much of a particular drug, many overdoses occur not due to the amount of the substance, but the environment in which it is used in. Heroin addicts are more likely to overdose when they inject in an unfamiliar environment, for the same reason Siegel's rats were more likely to die when they received heroin in an unfamiliar room. The environmental cues they've learned to associate with the drug are absent, so the conditioned compensatory response doesn't kick in, meaning their body is not properly prepared for the effects of the drug. Injecting rooms, by contrast, establish consistent environmental cues, allowing the compensatory response to work its magic and potentially reducing fatalities. And when you think about it, a similar principle applies to alcohol. Of course, the stakes are nowhere near as drastic, and you're less likely to die from a cider overdose than a heroin overdose. But this does go some ways towards explaining why it's easier to accidentally get drunker than you intended when you're drinking somewhere unusual, like at an office party or a house you haven't been to before, compared to a more familiar environment. The environmental cues your brain normally uses to prepare your body to deal with the alcohol aren't there. So when the alcohol hits, it hits harder than usual. So whilst dedicated drinking rooms are probably a bit excessive for the average person, it is worth keeping this effect in mind the next time you go for a night out. If you're visiting somewhere for the first time, go a bit lighter on whatever substances you're using than you perhaps normally would. And on the flip side, if you were specifically trying to get drunk, do it somewhere familiar and safe. It's a lot easier to keep to your limits when your brain knows what's coming. So there you go. Never thought you'd hear drinking advice on this show, did you? But to be fair, I never thought I'd be giving it either, and yet here we are. So to recap, we've looked at 4 different explanations for drinking behaviour. Simple learning, through which we become habituated to the taste of alcohol. Operant conditioning, through which drinking alcohol is positively reinforced by the positive feelings it leads to. Social learning theory, where we learn to drink alcohol by witnessing other people getting drunk. And classical conditioning, through which we learn to associate alcohol with positive experiences and through which we learn to tolerate it. Hopefully, by now you can see the value in having multiple different lenses through which to view an issue. Each of these 4 perspectives offers something new to the table, and combined, they offer a fairly holistic explanation for the psychology of alcohol. But these things can get even more interesting, because now we can start using these theories in tandem. A 1984 study, for instance, investigated the relationship between operant and classical conditioning in drinking behaviour. In this study, participants were given alcohol, then asked to complete a complex psychomotor task. After completing the task, the participants were either given information about how well they performed and a monetary reward, or just the information on their performance. Furthermore, half the participants received their reward regardless of how well they performed, whilst the other half were only rewarded if they were able to complete the task as if they were uninhibited. As the participants completed the trials, the researchers measured how quickly they developed a tolerance to the alcohol. Remember that tolerance is the result of classical conditioning, as our brains learn to associate the alcohol with the environment we consume it in, and try to counteract its effects. What this study found is that the participants who were given the monetary reward built a tolerance to the alcohol faster than those who were given just the information, and those who had to act uninhibited to receive the reward developed their tolerance faster than those who received the reward either way. The presence of an operant reinforcer contingent on a participant learning to tolerate alcohol increased the rate at which the conditioned compensatory response developed. In other words, the participants who had a reason to tolerate the alcohol quite literally learned to tolerate it quicker than those who didn't. This is really interesting because it means operant conditioning can impact the rate at which classical conditioning occurs, which has massive implications for how we learn new behaviours. I mean, even just focusing on alcohol, if we learn associations quicker when we are rewarded for doing so, then that has massive ramifications for how we learn to associate alcohol with the surrounding environment. After all, drinking environments are full of positive reinforcement. Fun times with friends, one-night stands, increased confidence, even just the buzz of alcohol itself, all of which potentially increase the rate at which our brains connect alcohol to all sorts of other things in the environment. This is massive for explaining how and why people drink, but it also goes some way towards explaining why people trying to quit drinking often relapse. See, that's the other insight classical conditioning provides into our relationship with alcohol and other drugs. It can teach us why it can be so hard to quit. In the classical conditioning episode, we briefly touched upon the concept of extinction, which is the process by which a classically conditioned response is inhibited. Typically, this occurs by repeatedly exposing the subject to the conditional stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus, so that it loses the conditional response. Keeping with our original example of someone who, after a bad night out, feels nauseous when they taste vodka, this association could be extinguished if this person was repeatedly made to eat things that taste like vodka cake or, vodka Kit Kats, without getting sick. Eventually, their brain will learn that the flavour of vodka is safe, and the response will be extinguished. Importantly, however, the association is not deleted or forgotten. It's still there, it's just overwritten by a new association. Namely, that the taste of vodka does not predict humiliating yourself on your friend's bathroom floor. And this is important, because whilst the process of extinction can go a long way towards helping people unlearn the associations that might be driving their addiction, extinguished responses can return, given the right circumstances. In particular, the theory of classical conditioning gives us 4 distinct mechanisms through which an extinguished response can return, leading to relapse. The first is called reacquisition, and it refers to the fact that if the conditional and unconditioned stimuli are paired again, the association will be learned quicker this time. Let's say that, for the sake of the argument, I am a recovering alcoholic. When I first went sober, it was quite difficult, because all sorts of random things, ranging from the bar I used to frequent to the friends I used to drink with, made me crave alcohol. In other words, I have learned a classically conditioned association between these environmental stimuli and drinking. But having since quit drinking, these associations have been extinguished, because seeing my friends or walking past the bar no longer predicts drinking. If I were to go out drinking with my friends again, I would relearn the association between my friends and drinking much quicker this time, through reacquisition. This may be part of why some people find that going cold turkey is the most effective way to quit an addiction. If I instead decided to drink, say, once a month, then it's possible that all sorts of unhealthy associations would be extinguished each month only to be reacquired, limiting my ability to quit for good. Alternatively, the cravings might come back at random points, some amount of time after I've gone sober, for no particular reason at all. This is also a legitimate observed phenomenon, and it's called spontaneous recovery. It happens with all sorts of classically conditioned responses, including fears, anxieties, and in our case, addictions. On the other hand, my cravings could come back through reinstatement, which occurs through exposure to the unconditioned stimulus alone. So for instance, if I, having been sober for a while, decided to have a drink by myself at home, then the next time I see my drinking buddies, that might trigger my cravings, because, again, my brain hasn't forgotten the original association. It's still down there, waiting to be triggered. Finally, my cravings could return through renewal, which occurs due to exposure to the conditional stimulus alone in either the same or a different context. So, simply hanging out with my old drinking buddies might trigger my cravings, if for no other reason than because my brain still remembers the association between hanging out with these dudes and getting smashed. Whilst these processes are, of course, problematic for anyone trying to go sober, they provide a crucial insight into how conditioned responses work, which means we can use them to our advantage when trying to quit. For instance, the concept of renewal sheds light into how exactly extinction occurs. As I keep mentioning, extinction does not involve the forgetting of an association. It involves a new association being developed that challenges the original association. The return of a conditioned response, then, might occur because the environmental cues used to trigger the inhibitory association are absent. That's a mouthful, but a study by Wilcox and McNally sheds some light into how this process works. In this study, rats were trained to seek alcohol, then had this response extinguished. During the extinction process, an unusual sound was played for 60 seconds. In other words, this sound was an extinction cue, something in the environment associated with the inhibition of the conditioned response. Then, whilst the rats were undergoing a renewal process, in which the associations with alcohol would normally return, the sound was played again, which limited the effectiveness of renewal. Hearing the sound reminded the rats of the extinction training they had gone through, which helped keep the conditioning at bay. Now, the usefulness of this in human conditioning is debatable, as there are way more stimuli at play in a real-world situation compared to a lab setting, but it's an interesting field of research in any case. Perhaps some sort of musical therapy could be used in the future for those trying to quit addictions. I don't know, but it's something to think about. But even more than stopping its return, we can use classical conditioning to quit alcohol in the first place. If you recall the episode dedicated to classical conditioning, we spoke much about the role of evaluative conditioning, in which our attitudes towards particular stimuli are conditioned in advertising. And whilst positive associations can be used to sell us things, negative associations may be able to help us quit addictions too. Multiple studies have been conducted demonstrating that pairing cues associated with alcohol with negative images or words contributes to negative attitudes towards, reduced cravings for, and reduced consumption of alcohol, both in the lab and for a short time following the experiment. So perhaps there's some hope there as well. Conditioning isn't necessarily this sinister, malicious thing that the deep state uses to control us. Most of the time, it's a completely normal, ubiquitous process that occurs all around us each and every day. Sometimes it can be maladaptive, but very often it can be helpful. I think there's a bit of a tendency in psychology to focus on the negative aspects of our world. People love doing armchair psychology on serial killers and terrorists, not philanthropists and altruists. We talk ad nauseum about depression, but not so much well-being. And yes, when we talk about learning theory, we tend to focus on how we learn maladaptive behaviours, and less on how we learn to be good, productive, righteous people. And yet, that's psychology too. Operant conditioning might be a major reason why people develop addictions, but it can also be used to teach discipline and good behaviours. Social learning theory might contribute to antisocial behaviours, but it can instill pro-social behaviours too. And, case in point, classical conditioning might be the reason for fears and cravings, but it can also save our lives and help us quit our addictions. So keep that in mind the next time you feel like giving a rat a lethal dose of heroin. I'm not here to tell you to quit drinking alcohol, or to quit any behaviour for that matter. The call is yours to make, and I'm just a disembodied voice on the internet. What would I know? But I am asking you to think a little bit about why you do the things you do. You don't have to. There are no consequences if you don't. Your life will continue on as before. If anything, you will be substantially less obnoxious to your friends. I'm sure mine are tired of me pointing out examples of operant and classical conditioning already anyway. But I do think there's a beauty in observing the cogs of our world turn. They are unbearably complex, and I don't claim to fully understand them, but I don't need to understand something to admire it. That lesson has taken a very long time for me to learn. But, luckily, I don't plan to stop learning anytime soon. Thank you very much for listening. This episode is a bit of a finale to the last three. We might return to learning psychology at some point in the future, but for now, I think it's best to put it to the side and look at something new. Unless I have a spontaneous epiphany and/or prophetic vision, I plan to focus on social psychology for the next few episodes. Conformity, cognitive dissonance, attribution theory, obedience, and so on. That being said, for now, I am extraordinarily grateful to each and every person who listens to this podcast. It is a privilege and an honour to have anyone voluntarily listen to me for the amount of time that you have done so up until this point. So thank you. Sincerely. As always, I hope you learned something. If you don't like what I have to say, great, thanks for hearing me out anyway. Do your own research and come to your own conclusions. This show is written, performed, and produced by me. Music by Matt Ponio. Whether it's simple or complex, about the world or about yourself, from me or from anyone else. I hope you learned something today.